one of the things that I believe is true about AI is that this is the first time that we have built machines that have crossed the threshold from the highly complicated into the truly complex. And I will say I'm listening to this conversation with a mixture of profound hope and dread, because it seems to me that it is obvious that the potential good that can come from this technology is effectively infinite. But I would say that the harm is probably 10 times. It's a bigger infinity. And the question of how we are going to get to a place where we can leverage the obvious power that is here to do good and dodge the worst harms, I have no idea. I know we're not prepared. The idea of something that can solve problems on your behalf while you're doing something else is marvelous, but of course, that is the precondition for absolute devastation to arise out of a miscommunication, right? To have something acting autonomously to accomplish a goal, you damn well better understand what the goal really is and how to pull back the reins in the event that it starts accomplishing something that wasn't the goal. The potential for abuse is also utterly profound. So too is the need for cautionary tales, which we don't have. That's the problem, is that there's no body of myth that will warn us properly of this tool, because we've just crossed a threshold that is similar in its capacity to alter the world as the invention of writing. I really think that's where we are. We're talking about something that is going to fundamentally alter what humans are with no plan. Writing alters the world slowly because the number of people who can do it is tiny at first and remains so for thousands of years. This is changing things weekly. And that's an awful lot of power to just simply have dumped on a system that wasn't well regulated to begin with. So we have several different categories of systems. We have simple systems, we have complicated systems, we have complex systems, and then we have complex adaptive systems. And to most of us, a highly complicated system appears like a complex system. We don't understand the distinction. Technologists often master highly complicated systems, and they know, for example, a computer is a perfectly predictable system inside. It's deterministic. But to most of us, it functions, it is mysterious enough that it feels like a complex system. And if you're in the position of having mastered highly complicated systems, and you look at complex systems and you think it's a natural extension, you fail to anticipate just how unpredictable they are. So even if it is true that today there are limits to what these machines can do based on their training data, I think the problem is, to see what's going to happen, you really want to start thinking of this as the evolution of a new species that will continue to evolve. It will partially be shaped by what we ask it to do, the direction we lead it, and it will partially be shaped by things we don't understand. So how does this computer that we have work? Well, one of the things that it does is we plug them into each other. Using language, it's almost as if you've plugged an Ethernet cable in between human minds, and that means that the cognitive potential exceeds the sum of the individual minds in question. Your AIs are going to do that, and that means that our ability to say what they are capable of does not come down to, well, we didn't train it on that data. As they begin to interact, that feedback is going to take them to capabilities we don't anticipate and may not even recognize once they become present. That's one of my fears. This is an evolving creature, and it's not even an animal. If it were an animal, you could say something about what the limits of that capability are. But this is a new type of biological creature, and it will become capable of things that we don't even have names for. I am not a doomer. I agree that the doomers are likely incorrect, that their fears are misplaced. But I do think we have a question of a related rates problem. I said the potential for good here is infinite, and the potential for bad is 10 times, right? What I mean is, There are lots of ways in which this obviously empowers people to do things that they were going to be otherwise stuck in the mundane process of learning to code and then figuring out how to make the code work and bring it to market and all of that. And this solves a lot of those problems. And that's obviously a good thing. Really, what we should want is the wealth creation object as quickly as we can get there. But the problem is, as much as that hyper creative individual is empowered to make wealth, the person who is interested in stealing may be even more empowered. And I'm concerned about that at a pretty high level. The abuse cases may outnumber the use cases, and we don't have a plan for what to do about that. We are at the dawn of this radical transformation of humans that, by its very nature as a truly complex and emergent innovation, nobody on Earth can predict what's going to happen. We're on the event horizon of something, and the problem is, we can talk about the obvious disruptions, the job disruption, and that's going to be massive. And does that lead some group of elites to decide, oh, well, suddenly we have a lot of useless eaters, and what are we going to do about that? Because that conversation tends to lead somewhere very dark very quickly. But I think that's just the beginning of the various ways in which this could go wrong without the doomer scenarios coming into play. This is an uncontrolled experiment in which all of humanity is downstream. In game theory, we have something called a collective action problem. And in the market that you're describing, an individual company has no capacity to hold back the abuses of AI. The most you can do is not participate in them. You can't stop other people from programming LLMs in some dangerous way. And you can limit your own ability to earn based on your own limitations of what you're willing to do. And then effectively what happens is the technology gets invented anyway, it's just that the dollars end up in somebody else's pocket. So the incentive is not to restrain yourself so that you can at least compete and participate in the market that's going to be opened. And so the number of ways in which you can abuse this technology, let's take a couple. What is to stop somebody from training LLMs on an individual's creative output and then creating an LLM that can outcompete that individual, can effectively not only produce what they would naturally produce over the course of a lifetime, but can extrapolate from it and can even hybridize it with the insights of other people, so that effectively those who have the LLM can train it on the creativity of others, not cut them in on the use of that insight. You can effectively end up putting yourself out of business by putting your creative ideas in the world where they get sucked up as training data for future LLMs. That is unscrupulous, but it's effectively guaranteed. In fact, it's already happening. If we look back at the invention of the cell phone or the invention of the social media platforms, there would be every reason to have exactly the same perspective, right? I remember the beginning of Facebook, and I remember the idea that suddenly the process that used to afflict people, where you would just lose touch with most of the people who had been important to you, that was not something that needed to happen anymore. You could just retain them permanently as a part of a diffuse social grouping that just simply grew and value was added. There's no end to how much good that did. But what it did to us was profound and not evident in the first chapter. Say the same thing about the cell phones and the dopamine traps and the way this has disconnected us from each other, the way it has disconnected us from nature, the way it has altered the very patterns with which we think. It has altered every classroom. So, and those things I think are going to turn out to have been sort of minor foreshadowings of the disruption that AI will produce. So I agree with you. Today, the amount you can do with AI is a tremendous amount of good. There's a little bit of harm. Maybe that's something we need to worry about. But as this develops, as we get to, to peer over the edge of this cliff that we're headed to, I think we're going to discover that we can't yet detect the nature of the alteration that's coming.